Welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to introduce Gerard Reid. He's an investment banker from Ireland and a leading authority on the changes going on across the worlds of energy and mobility. He's a founding partner of Alexa Capital, which delivers corporate advisory, financing and asset management solutions across the energy infrastructure, mobility and energy technology sectors. He's also a member of the Global Future Council on Advanced Energy Technologies at the World Economic Forum. He has spent over 15 years working in investment banking and has taught in various universities across the world. So, Gerard, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
What I do realize as I'm here this morning is I come from a completely different world, and I come from the finance world, and you might sort of say, well, what the hell is he doing here this morning? And I suppose, just background-wise, I used to be a technology analyst, so my job was to advise investors what to do with their money in the technology space. And in 2004, somebody asked me to look at a solar company. And I went to Berlin and met the founder of this solar company, and I told my client not to invest in the company because I said, this technology is a joke. And I went back to him in London and he said to me, Gerard, you'd please go back and meet the entrepreneur. So I went back to Berlin, met the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur blew me away in terms of how his vision for solar and what he thought was going to happen in the cost of solar. And just give you an idea, at the time, the cost of generating electricity with solar was about 55 euro cents a kilowatt hour, right? And today, right, this in Germany, and it's at 5 cents, right? So he was right, and I told my client to invest in this, and suddenly I ended up being the one-eyed man in the land of the blind, and my career brought me into the energy space. And I spent many years as a utility analyst and a sort of clean tech analyst as well. And that meant, for example, clean tech was all those things that nobody else wanted to do. So I had the fortune of 10 years ago actually covering Tesla, which at the time I also realized was going to revolutionize the world and has revolutionized the world. And nobody in the automobile team in my investment bank wanted to cover Tesla because they all thought electric, it's a bit of a joke, right? So obviously 10 years on, we're in a different space. But I would just say that that's my background. And I'm going to really, I suppose, by the way, just by fortune, I'm Irish, business is in London and the US. It's a corporate finance business, so that means we're advising M&A transactions in and around this transition. But we also, just for your benefit, we also did the first PPA in the UK market 5 years ago now at this point in time. So we did a 25-year PPA between McDonald's Corporation and a solar developer, 150 megawatts worth of solar dotted across the UK. And then we actually did a sleeving arrangement with Hydro to make sure that basically McDonald's peak needs were met for 25 years. So that was the first. So just give you an idea, we're also in the space that you guys are active in. And I'm obviously really, really convinced that we're in a revolution in the energy space. And I'm going to go through and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the last 15 months because certainly in my career, I've never seen anything like it, right? And I'm sure for you on the buyer side, you probably feel the same. So let me just talk. What I would also like to do to you is, I've got sort of 2 parts or 3 parts, which is really what happened in 2021. And I'm starting in 21. It's nothing to do with the Ukrainian crisis. We're starting in 21. I want to explain what happened then. Talk a little bit about the Ukrainian crisis, what it means, and understanding then the last 15 months. And at that point in time, we'll stop and we'll just take questions, right? The sections down below are discussion points, right? I don't really know what's going to happen in the future. I can maybe give a better guess than somebody else, but I have no crystal ball. And the bottom line is, none of us know what Mr. Putin's going to do. And depending on what he does, this could all be wrong. But it is important to talk about this. And I think the last point I'd like to bring up is what you should do. I'm just going to give you, if I was in your situation and I was a buyer of energy, what I would do. Okay, so that's sort of what I'm going to talk about. So let me just talk by talking about, last year, just to give you an idea, that Europe's summer was the hottest on record. We saw 49 degrees reached in Sicily. And by the way, just today, if you go to New Delhi's also hit record temperatures today. All right, so it's not just in Europe, but we saw record temperature across the world, and it's continuing this year. The other thing we saw was gas prices explode. Now remember, this is last year. This is not now. This has nothing to do with Ukraine, right? This is unprecedented rise in gas prices last year. And what you also had was carbon prices going through the roof, right? Almost hitting €100 at the end of the year. And I suppose the craziest thing for anybody that's in the electricity markets is you were seeing, this was a December day, December 2021, what you saw was right across Europe, wholesale power prices being higher than retail power prices. And just realize the madness of what I just said there. So you're in France and you're paying, the customer is paying 27, and EDF, who's trying to buy power on the market because they're short, is buying it at €277 a megawatt hour, right? Just realize that. That's what we had right across the country. And again, a year before that, they were €50, okay? Other thing that happened was the volatility. This is from the Nordic markets, which just gives you an idea, is what you saw at the end of the year was unprecedented volatility across the Nordic markets. I could have taken any market across Europe, but basically volatility we've never seen before. I would also say that if we were talking about where you put your money in, you would have made no money if you'd have put it into clean energy. All right, Vestas share price, biggest wind turbine manufacturer in the world, down 30%, BP up 30%. That was the year that you had last year. Other thing that happened was coal prices. Coal prices really from $60 a ton at the euros a ton, they hit 180 at the end of the year, and you saw a massive coal comeback. I saw the statistics the other day, which is in Europe. Europe is about a 10% increase in coal consumption last year, and China about 5%. United States is like 18%, right? So massive increases in coal. And then despite all this, what we saw was craziness in the climate tech area. So just gives you an idea of the amount of money that was being raised. Just in Q4 of last year, 13 billion it went in venture capital money went into the space. That's more than the equivalent of 2019 and 20 together, right? And the best example is a Norwegian business called Freyr, which is a PowerPoint company, which raised 600 million on the New York Stock Exchange. And by the way, it's not a criticism of Freyr, because I know the CEO very well, and he's done a very good job. But ultimately, they had a concept in a PowerPoint presentation and said, we want to build a zero-carbon battery factory in Europe, and we're going to do it in Norway. And he went to the US markets and raised $600 million, right? He's now in the process of building that factory, right? I've never in my career seen anything like this, right? And that was just one example. I mean, there's loads of these examples of this, right? At the same time, what we saw was EV market, 29 billion raised on the public markets, most of which is in North America, but also in China. 29 billion. I can't even keep up with the names of these businesses, right? But I suppose the reason is because EV sales doubled last year, right? And by the way, growth expectations are way ahead of what everyone expected. Most people thought, you might see 40% growth year on year. You saw at the end of the year 20% of German car sales, right? The land of the internal combustion engine, electric, fully electric, right? It was also a crazy year for offshore wind and wind in general. So wind installed last year, 94 gigawatts of wind across the globe. That was the second highest on record. So you can see this 2020 and 2020. But the most interesting thing was the blue box you can see there. And that is 21 gigawatts of offshore wind. So just to give you an idea, that's basically China. So China installed in 1 year what the rest of the world did in offshore wind in the last decade. Right? This is what they did in 1 year. But incredible growth, as I said, in particular in offshore wind, and that's going to continue. Solar is the craziest one. Installations last year were up 24%. And that's despite price increases. And just to give you an idea, you had in the range of 180 gigawatts of solar. Remember, I go back to 2004, 16 years ago. It's not that long ago. The market was 1 gigawatt. So we've gone from 1 gigawatt to 220 gigawatts. And in terms of production capacity in the world, you have about 300 gigawatts of capacity, right? So the amount of production we've built in this space is crazy. The same has happened in batteries. Batteries is just the beginning. But last year, wasn't a huge number last year. Last year you had sort of in the region of 10 gigawatts installed across the world. But that's more than what was installed in the previous 5 years. And actually, this year, same thing, you're probably going to be up to 20 gigawatts. So you've got a market that's basically growing at 60, 70% a year. And this is not subsidy driven, I would just say to you. I have a battery in my home. I do it because it makes economic sense. I'm not doing it because of any other reason. And I would also say, and I'll finish that section just to say, what we've got is lots of hype around hydrogen. It's everywhere, okay? But sorry, I have to look at the numbers. 2021, there was 450 megawatts, not gigawatts, 450 megawatts installed, right? But its hype is everywhere. And actually, share prices, ITM Power, is a UK business. It has a 3 billion market cap, and it had 0 revenues last year. Right? That's the world we're in hydrogen at present, is that huge amount of hype, but not a lot going on. Let me turn just to talk about the Ukrainian crisis, right? And what this has meant. Remember, that was 2021, before the Ukrainian stuff. So what the Ukrainian crisis has done is, number one, it's driven oil prices to the highest level since 2014. That's the first big impact, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the second thing is, it's put European gas prices up tenfold. Right, so we've got oil and gas up at levels we've never seen, but you've also got, and I would say this, stress across the whole system. Now what this is, and it's maybe important to explain, this is the German power markets, week 4, some of the words, the end of January. The green is renewables, it's basically wind, because there's not much sun in Germany in a winter's day. The red is the power price, and the grey is fossil fuels and nuclear. So what you see, if you can see over the right there, it gives you an idea, is the power price. So we can see at the beginning of the week, what you had power price at 300 euros. Guess what? At the end of the week, you had power prices of 0. So you went from 300 euros a megawatt hour to 0 at the weekend. And by the way, if I showed you this for Easter Sunday, right across Europe, there was 0 power prices. The next day, Monday, France at 300 euros. So you went from 0 to 300 in 24 hours. It's all weather dependent, right? Used to be that it was dependent on even gas production, gas consumption was dependent on it. Now, everything is dependent on the weather, right? And this volatility is very, very difficult for people to deal with. But there's a huge opportunity in this area for this. The other thing that you're seeing is utilities under, share prices under massive pressure. Anyone who had anything to do with Russia, Ukraine, or any exposure there, prices collapsed. And by the way, I've never seen this before. Utilities, when they move 2% in a day, you go, wow, that was a big move. And you see Uniper, German utility, 43%, and it did that in a week. Engie, same thing. Even Enel, EDF, same. All these businesses under stress because of it, right? I will say one thing which you probably haven't heard of, but I will just bring it up. There has been cyber attacks on the power system. I used to laugh to myself if I wanted to take out the power system, and I'm not joking when I say it, the Russians know it now, so they've done it, is the Russians attacked 2 wind turbine manufacturers, Nordex and Enercon. Why did they do that? Because Nordex and Enercon have systems which allow them to control all the turbines that they own across the world. So I don't need to attack the power grid or to attack the control room. I just attack the wind turbine manufacturers and get control of their systems, and I can ramp up and down wind turbines across the world, and you can cause chaos, right? The Russians basically did 2 attempts. One, they broke into Nordex's systems, but the interesting one they did with Enercom was that they broke into their satellite communications. Now, they didn't do anything, but they were making a statement. The statement was, anytime you want, guys, we'll take out your power system, okay? The next thing I would say is unhappy customers across the board, right? If any of you do not have good contracts in place, yeah, you're not happy, right? You've got to have CEOs screaming at you saying, what's going on here? Gas prices have doubled, et cetera, et cetera. It's right across the board across Europe, right? Retail customers saying we want stuff. And what you've got is governments and regulators reacting everywhere. And everyone, it's not coordinated. So Norway goes and says we're going to subsidize every customer. Germany decides they're going to subsidize people who are buying fuels, and they're going to give 300 euros to everybody. Every country is doing something different, right? And I think the other thing that happened in all of this was clean energy stocks imploded. So you would say to yourself, oh, they should be winners in this. Well, it just gives you an idea of solar and fuel cells. This was just in the first quarter. You can see fuel cells down 26%, solar down 16%, EVs down 16%. The guys you think would be the winners, share prices collapsed to them, all right? And the other thing, of course, that happened was the commodity prices have exploded. Other ones, lithium, nickel, wheat, I could go on and on and on, right? But basically, you've got stress right across this. And And actually, if Mr. Tesla is not hedged, what actually ends up happening is the cost of doing a battery is such that the Tesla battery price is going up by, you see there, I just worked them out there the other day. What you end up with is a threefold increase in battery prices, okay? So the final thing I would say in all of this is that what you've got is liquidity issues across the market. Uniper, and I'll come back to Uniper later on, they did this in December. Why? Uniper, the volatility is such that hedging is becoming really, really expensive. You've got margin calls everywhere. I've got a contract that I have to supply to somebody, and guess what? I have to put money on his balance sheet to make him sure that I can pay him. So that's what we have going on in the market. So as I said, pretty crazy situations. And I suppose then I suppose that's the question is, what's actually happened in all this? And I just want to try and give you a view of what's happened. And I will start with 2021. Why did it happen? This is the first thing. It's nothing to do with Russia. It is to do with China. We have integrated world energy markets in all commodities except electricity. China decides they're going to go away from coal to gas. 10% increase in demand is the equivalent of France's demand for the year. By the way, they're going to do the same this year, right? So just that alone is the reason why the prices went up. And nobody, and I have utilities as clients, I've seen presentations last March to boards of big utilities where the analysis teams did not even understand what was going on there because they thought gas is a local thing. And guess what? They got killed. They absolutely got killed because they didn't understand this. The second thing that happened was too many industrial participants, starting with you guys in the room, believe the narrative that's been going on for the last decade is that energy is going to be for free. What a load of bullshit. I'm sorry. Energy is not for free. Somebody has to pay for it. So it can be subsidized, it can be done by a government or whatever, but somebody has to pay for it, and did no hedging. So in the UK, give you an idea, there's 38 utilities have gone bankrupt to date. None of them hedged. So I'm selling you something at a fixed price for a contract of 2 years, and I don't go and buy it, I think. Now, these same utilities are then going to the government and saying, oh, please, 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 bail us out, bail us out. Sorry, maybe I'm just a hard capitalist, but I go, that's just bad risk management by these companies, right? And I say the same to any of you who have done the same as well. If you haven't done it, that's just bad management, right? The other thing I would say is lack of upstream expenditure in oil and gas. I am all about getting to net zero, right? But if I actually look what's happened in the market, what I would say to you is we're not investing in oil and gas. And you can see this here. This is global oil and gas expenditures across the world. And I use the example starting with Russia. Gazprom. Gas price has been going down for 10 years until last year. Do you think you're going to invest in new equipment and in new drilling facilities and transport facilities in that type of environment? No, you're not. Because I won't give you the money. Finance guys won't give you the money. That's what happened. So the expenditure hasn't been there. So if you don't have expenditure in this type of environment, guess what happens? At some point you have a shortfall. Right? There's just not enough gas out there. And by the way, it's the same with oil. There is not enough oil in the world at present, right? And I'll come back to that later on, but there's not. The other thing that happened is, and we have to really look at France, is that French nuclear reactors are out. Half the French nuclear reactors are out. Right? So just realize that what I'm saying there, right? That's 25 gigawatts of firm power that's out at present. And they're not going to come back on until probably this time next year. Some of them come back on, but they have a rolling plan. And actually, the more and more they dig into the nuclear plants in France, the more they realize that they've got design errors. They've got design faults. They're not telling you this, but they've got design faults in them. They've got micro cracks in the reactors, which take a long while to fix. Huge cultural issues within the French nuclear industry, right? I have a Finnish client who has asked, I said, what do you think about what's the biggest threat to the future of nuclear? And they said, France. That's it. That's the reason why. Okay, I know you can complain to the Germans and say, well, they're closing their nuclear plants. They are, absolutely, and maybe they shouldn't. But the bottom line is, if we can't get the technology to work properly, then we've got a problem. And that's really the big issue in the power markets, because guess what you do with a nuclear power plant? You run it 24 hours a day. So guess what? That means then that you're not putting gas onto the system. right? Because you just keep it running. And you'll actually allow power prices to get to zero on days when there's lots of wind and solar, because you're not going to ramp down that nuclear power plant. Well, when you've got half of them out now, and the Germans having half theirs out, then you can see what happens. The market gets tight, and only thing that you can do is go into gas. The other thing, of course, is Russia, which is, if you look at what's gone on in Europe here, what's a big issue? The big issue is that we're totally dependent on Russia for our fossil fuels. And I live in Germany, so I can understand the German view, which was best way to deal with the Russians is to integrate with them. This worked in Europe. This is why we have a European Union. Peaceful Europe in the 21st century will be a wealthy Europe. That was the view. Hasn't worked with Russia. And obviously, we're going to have a radical change in the way we deal with fossil fuels going forward. But it's a long change, guys. It doesn't happen from one day to another, right? And I suppose the most concerning thing for me is, as a European, is I went and had a look at the German situation, because Germany really is the one that's the most under stress from this whole situation. Is 34% of oil of German oils coming, 55% of gas, 26% of coal. And then I went and downloaded the emergency plan for the federal government of Germany. This is a 2-year-old plan. They've now updated this, thank God. But I did a check through the document just to see if I could see the word Russia, and they didn't mention it. So they did not even think in their worst case scenarios that there could well be an issue with Russian supply. Now, sorry, I'm a finance guy, and we call that risk. That's risk, right? 55% of your gas comes from there. You go and sort of say, well, I need to diversify. Germans didn't do this at all, right? So and I'll stop there at this point in time before looking to the forward. That's what's happened at the past. That's what I give my summary of what's happened over the last 18 months. I'll stop and just ask if you have any questions on the past, and then we'll go to the future. Any questions on it?
I think you can go to a question. I'm just curious to understand also from the point of view of gas storage stocks, because we were seeing in the first graph how the gas price have been hiking already since mid-2021, but it felt that gas storage stocks were also at record lows. So I believe that in a way it does have something to do still with the, geopolitical situation in Ukraine somehow. It feels that somehow Gazprom was kind of preparing for it in a way. Curious to hear your thoughts on that. Well,
I just say if you look at Gazprom last year, Gazprom production was at an all-time high. Mm-hmm. And they were delivering all the quantities that were required under their contracts into Europe, right? So for me, yeah, as I said, and we also had a mild winter. So I think actually we're probably lucky that we're able to have got through the winter. I just think, for me, the perspective was that we have not in any way prepared for any eventuality that there could be problems with it. And the Germans were obsessed with Nord Stream 2, building this other pipeline, and everybody except for the Poles were really well prepared, but everybody else, none of them prepared for this eventuality. So it's a really big shock to the system, but it's definitely, and I'm going to talk about this, it's definitely going to change energy forever in Europe. There's no doubt about it. And if I talk about why I think it will be, let's talk for you, short term, what this means. Europe's probably in a recession already, right? Whether you like it or not. And we can pump money in to maybe cover it up. But this gives you an idea of I just took Rabo Research, and looking at, their view is that, look, you can see what goes on there. If you do have to have proper sanctions on energy and Russia, yeah, it's going to hit all of us across Europe, right? There's just no way around it, okay? And we're on the verge of that, I would say, okay? What I would say is the US is going to fare much better because they're energy independent. They've got enough coal, they've got enough renewables in the system, got oil, they've got gas. Yeah, they've got some issues, but nothing major. But still, even at this is Goldman Sachs' view, and this was from a few weeks ago, was that it could also go into recession in the US. Right? So if you can imagine if we have a recession, or they have a recession, what type of recession we're going to have, right? So that I would say is a big picture. The next thing I would say is stresses in the system are going to stay there, and I'd say just talk about food. Obviously, Ukraine is the biggest supplier of fertilizer in Europe, right? Well, good luck on that, right? Wheat export, you see this yourself there. Russia's the number 1, Ukraine there number 5. So listen, we can feed ourselves, don't get me wrong, but why should my local farmer sell the price low to his neighbor when the global market price is much higher. He's going to sell it at the global market price. So we have a situation definitely in the food market where this is going to have a big impact in the developing world. There's no doubt about this, okay? So that's the first thing. And if I want to talk about, let's talk about the oil space. Just talk about Russia's. This just gives you an idea of Russia. Russia's normally at about production about 11 million barrels. Russia production is already down 2 million. And the sanctions, real sanctions, don't start until April, or the end of April, right? So just be clear on this. The real sanctions haven't really started on Russia yet. And the reason this is happening is that Russia doesn't have any storage facilities in oil. So guess what they have to do? They throw it through a pipeline or they put it in a ship. Well, guess what? It's very difficult for them to get the ships in these days, et cetera, et cetera. And if we close the pipeline in from Russia, then you can see what will happen is their production collapses because they can't store it anywhere. All right, so already seeing stress in the Russian system. These are substantial numbers. So the world's at 100 million barrels a day. So taking 2 million barrels out is really, really significant. Here on the right, I just wanted to show you what this is just looking at inventories. So you've got oil, crude oil versus refined products like diesel and stuff like that. And there's no product problems in and around petrol, diesel, all that type of stuff. The problem is oil. And what's happening is we're digging into our reserves of oil right across the world now at present because of the fact that there is not enough production. Okay, and that's a pretty difficult situation. Depending on what happens here, I could say to you, you could see $200 oil. Okay, you could see $200 oil pretty quickly. And again, that's just any stress we put on Russia, the more likely that. The more stress we put on them, the more likely it is for it to hit $200. The other thing just in terms of gas is, and I think you saw this, Russia's already started cutting gas to Poland and Bulgaria, right? So we have to begin to prepare for this, right? But it's a difficult situation, and the reason it's difficult is because of this, and I do want to just explain this to you. This is Uniper, German utility. It's in between Gazprom and E.ON. It basically is taking, and you can see its revenues last year from Gazprom. Its costs are 100 billion. So 100 billion worth of purchases from Gazprom, and they're basically buying this at a discount to the spot price. They then have a whole pile of hedging arrangements to make sure that they're delivering to E.ON at 50 euros a megawatt hour power. Okay, and they've basically got one client, right? So this is all done through financial hedges, because remember that gas price is going up and down all the time. That's what they're doing. So who do you want to be? Do you want to be E.ON, or do you want to be Gazprom, or do you want to be Uniper in this? Well, what's clear is you don't want to be Uniper, right? Because Uniper's in bits. And depending on what happens, if the Russians cut the gas, Uniper loses. E.ON will keep the sort of guarantees that are on its balance sheet, so it should be okay. If the German government, the EU, cuts it, well, guess what? Uniper's still dead, and E.ON will probably be in trouble as well, and then there'll be a legal fight with Gazprom, right? That's a mess. I'm just using one company as an example of what's going on in the markets, and that's why German government is looking at that and saying, we have to make sure that this does not go into systemic risk. They've put together a 100 billion fund to actually make sure the Unipers of this world have the cash that they need to meet their margin requirements and stuff like this. But as I said, systemic risk, and I'm only using one company as an example, right? So in addition to this, and this is just, again, going back to this is the Bundesbank published the other day, what would happen, and this would be just in the current situation, what will happen away from if we go decide to really cut the gas. What they're saying actually is, and you see it down there, that you can see the reductions that they're saying just at present, at what's going on at present. But basically, if there is a full hit and we can't take any gas from the Russians, then it would be an extra 3% drop. I would say it's going to be worse than it, because I think, again, I would say to you, it's the financial market side of stuff that we don't understand. What happens if the European Energy Exchange goes bankrupt? Right? And you might say that's not going to happen. I'm just saying this is what you're dealing with in the background. They're dealing with the stresses in this market and how we make sure this happened. What I would say to you is, we can do without gas. I went and just looked and said to myself, okay, well, what happens if tomorrow we had to get off Russian gas by the end of the year? What could we do? Well, what we could do is, and it's a 1,600 terawatt hour challenge. You could do it, but it has to be Europe together. Because if one country tries to do it alone, they might survive, but the rest of Europe won't. So just very simple. Spain, Portugal, huge amounts of LNG terminals. They have got too many terminals. They've got too much. Their demand is not as high as the supply that they have. So they need to be able to transport it across into Europe. So you need the help of the Spanish and the Portuguese. Guess what? Whole pile of Eastern European countries have no gas. Has to come in from Germany. That's what it'll have to do if you cut it off from the other side. There's countries in Europe that have 100% of their oil coming from Russia through a pipeline. Slovakia, 100% of their oil. So how are they going to get their oil? You see where I'm coming from? It has to be a European solution. Sad thing is, our politicians don't talk about this. There's not one of them going up and saying, okay, let's really do this together. And if we don't do it together, we've got a problem. I did say, and I say one thing is that I saw the Norwegian government the other day say that they were considering cutting energy exports into Europe because it's pushing their power prices up. Now, we can all do that and get very selfish, but God help us in Europe if that's the way we go. And by the way, Norway is the richest country per head of population in Europe, so for them to say it is pretty scary. But you see where I'm coming from? The reason that's happening is because Norway prices are up is because they just built a new pipeline into Germany, right? And of course, if I'm a utility, I'm going to sell it into the German market because the power prices are higher, right? So that's what we've got short-term going on in the market, okay? Lots of risk, precarious situation to be in. What I will say is, though, I can predict the future beyond the next 12 months better than I can that. And I'll tell you why. So if I look, what I would say to you, what's really clear for me is that oil and fossil fuel prices will retrace. They always do. Just gives you an idea, just going back, what you see is they always come back into their normals. So I can put money on it that 24 months' time, oil prices are back down $80, $90. I can see gas prices also normalizing as well, coal prices, et cetera, et cetera. And why do I say this? Well, I say this because of this. It's because of China and Europe. So China, just gives you an idea of the numbers here, right? China and Europe are stuck in a corner, which is we don't have our own energy resources. So if you want to have freedom in energy, what you do, and independence, you go to renewables, because renewables can be grown in your own area. You put a nuclear power station in, you do something like that, that's what you do. That means you're not dependent on the US Fifth Fleet sitting off the coast of Taiwan and Singapore, who could at any day block oil transports coming into the country. You see where China's coming from. So the numbers here, China, just gives you an idea of the wind and solar additions. They're looking at doing 150 gigawatts of wind and solar this year. Just to give you an idea of the scale of what they're doing. We're not. We'll probably do 40 gigawatts in Europe here. So they're 3 times what the whole of Europe is at that. But the reason is because they have to do it, and we do too. And that's why I say to you, I'm actually quite positive about the future, because you have no choice. So I'll talk about what the path forward is. There's only one path. This is not me, this is the IEA. What you need to do is cut fossil fuels, and what you do is you increase clean electrification. It's electric. You look at their scenario, look at it, the blue is we're electrifying as much as we can of our systems. There's some stuff that you keep. You can see, the best case scenario, 2050, you still have natural gas, you've still a bit of oil, you've still got a coal, not an issue. But the bulk of your system is electric. And so for me, I look and I say, well, actually what we need to do is we need to rewire Europe. That's really what you do if you want to go and actually get away from fossil fuels, and you need to do it pretty quickly, okay? And I say there's 3 pillars to it. You electrify, renewabilize, and efficientize. So electrify is this. Why is it I say electrify? It's the only alternative burning fossil fuels. There's 3 ways to decarbonize. Biofuels, well, I can cover the whole of France in biofuels, and wheat and whatever, and you still won't be able to meet the biofuels needs of France. So it doesn't make any sense. E-fuels, hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. Yep, we do need them, don't get me wrong. But am I really going to use all that electricity to go and convert it into hydrogen with all the losses that it has, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, you might do it, but the first thing you're going to do is plug it in somewhere, right? You're going to directly use that electrification because it's cheaper, right? It's always cheaper to directly use it rather than convert it to one side or the other. Or you store it underground. Yeah, we might store a bit of it underground, but wow, God, it's really expensive. So let's not do all the expensive things at present. You do the cheaper things. I think we all realize that I can do without anything. What we can't do without is electricity. And actually, even fossil fuels need electricity. This is US, okay, Texas last year, type of year. Guess what? All their heating system failed because they're all electrical, right? They might have had the gas in the system, but they're all electrical. All the controls are electricity. So everything needs electricity. And the economics, and I just looked at the economics here of an internal combustion engine versus my EV. This is in Germany, 12 euros for 100 kilometers. And I'm at €1 basically if I've got solar on my roof. So, and the other thing I would say again is we've got a whole pile of regulations that are pushing us this way. And finally, it's really, what's easy about going electrification is we all have wires in place already. So you need to upgrade stuff, but you've got the infrastructure there. So you don't have to create a new hydrogen infrastructure that's not in place. If I look at Efficientize, it's all about, and why electrification is really important, is there's a diesel engine, 45 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, my EV, 15 kilowatt hours, right? 3 times more efficient. Put in a heat pump, 4 times more efficient. So it saves you money to go to electrification, but requires a different thinking to do this, right? Also, you've got a whole pile, what really gets me exciting from the finance world is a whole pile of new business models in and around this whole area. So heat as a service, decarbonization as a service, storage as a service. You've also got a whole pile of regulations that are pushing efficiency out there. And the other thing is, and I would say to you, is energy prices will force every one of you in the room to change the way you produce. You might even change where you produce. The fact about it is, if we look today, US gas prices are $7 a million BTU, and Europeans are at 36. BASF is dead. And by the way, BASF's dead even if you don't cut off the gas to the Russians, because you have to import LNG, right? We're going to diversify away from it. LNG is too expensive. There's no way of getting LNG down to a price that you get in a pipeline. So what does BASF have to do? They have to rethink the way they produce. There's no way around it. Or they're going to move the production, okay? We don't have gas in Europe to be able to give BASF the same price as they get in the US. US has a massive competitive advantage. But I did show on the right here, and this is from a company that is that's looking at steel production. They do control software for steel producers across the world, and they also do control software in the energy space. And this is a production the CEO gave a week ago. And his view was that basically all the big steel producers, aluminium producers, what they have to do is completely change the way they produce stuff and change the whole process so that processes react to changes in the weather. Remember all those times when prices are zero? You don't want to be producing when prices are 300 euros a megawatt hour. Go to this area, right? That is, I thought, quite an interesting view. The next thing I would say to you is the future system is built around renewables. Why? Well, the reason is because it's cheap. Okay, it's economics, right? Nothing bad about it. It's just cheap. This is across the world you look, most countries today, it's either wind or solar is the cheapest way to do it. And if I look going forward, prices are just going to continue down. And that's despite the fact that, and this is the innovations, particularly in solar, are pretty immense. It is only going to increase. And that's despite the fact that power prices, or these prices went up. Gives you an idea of solar last year. You can see what happened. Polysilicon prices up 3-fold. Freight, transporting it from China, up 4-fold. But despite that, prices went up slightly, but they're going to come down again this year. And again, this is just because there's innovations in other areas. And I would also say to you, the alternatives are too expensive. I'm not against nuclear. I think nuclear will become part of the system, and there'll be a small renaissance. But I say small because if I want to build a gigawatt nuclear power station, it will take me 10 years. If I want to build a gigawatt solar power station without any experience, 1 year. Without any experience, 1 year. Well, you can see what's going to happen, right? Okay. So let me stop there at this point in time, because I'm actually not going to, because I've not got a huge amount of time. I'm not going to go through the last section. I'm going to go to the section at the end which talks about what you should do. But I'll stop there for a second. Have you any questions? Yes.
You were just presenting the three pillars.
Yeah.
In a specific order.
Yeah.
Was that on purpose? Is your advice that we start with electrifying, or it was not on purpose?
No, actually, sorry. I'll come to that in the end. Can I? So what you should do, right? I did that because it wasn't done with you guys in mind, right? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Maybe regarding boost renewables, what challenges do you see regarding raw materials? Will there be enough? Do we see some supply
Right, so let's go through the different ones. Wind difficulty is just cost of steel, cost of copper, right? Turbines are getting bigger, prices are going up. That's the issue there. But there's no materials in a wind turbine that I go, oh shit, you won't be able to get your hands on it. Solar, exact same. Solar is the easiest because solar is basically silicon, some silver, some aluminium, that's it, right? No shortages whatsoever in that. And even the new technologies have iron in them, also same thing. So I don't see anything out of. I see the capacities in the solar market and what China is doing in terms of ramping up. I don't see any issues. Maybe the issue would be in the power electronic side, which is just semiconductors, right? Trying to get your hands on semiconductors is difficult, so inverter demand mightn't keep up. In the battery space, which I'm not going to talk about today in depth, but in the battery space, there's no doubt there's problems in the market because what's happened is the EV demand is just so high in comparison to the automobile manufacturers just don't have the materials they need. And when you're you see, if I was to show you the capacity expansions in batteries, they're faster than what's happened in solar in the last years, right? So we've gone from a market in batteries of 50 gigawatt hours a year to 500 gigawatt hours in the last 5 years, right? That's the scale of the production. So we have bottlenecks in the area, but for me, they're short term, I would say. And I would also say in the non-EV space, there's huge innovation in the battery area and cost reductions coming down like this. Yeah.
I recently also heard that there's a revival of pumped hydro to store electricity. Do you see this also in Europe?
No, not in Europe. I hope it will happen, but the issue is regulations. So firstly, there's a new water directive in Europe that makes it difficult, and each country is just, environment regulations are a disaster. So if I take the case of Sweden, if you want to build a wind park today, it'll probably take you 10 years. If you want to build a grid connector, it'll never happen. If you want to do pump storage, it'll never happen, right? It's just local planning laws, and these have to be dealt with very quickly. And again, I come from Ireland. Ireland is now bringing through emergency regulations to enable enable basically the authorities to get around local objections. And I see this happening more and more. There's no way around this, right? We're in an emergency situation now.
Thinking about that, we could do this with COVID. Fast track policies and so on. You think we could do the same thing in this crisis situation? Are you seeing that happening?
I do. And I certainly, yes, absolutely, I do. And I see the beginnings of that happening. But I also see some mad things happening from government. So for example, German government has said 2024, you're not going to be, as a homeowner, you're not allowed to buy a gas boiler or any form of fossil fuel boiler, right? And what's the alternative? Heat pumps, okay. Where am I going to get them? Who's going to install them? Right? There's some crazy stuff going on, but there's no doubt the opportunity in the space is ginormous because of the regulations that have been kicked off. Yeah.
You were speaking about rewiring Europe and putting everything to electrification. I think that's fine. Thanks. In Germany, we've gone to almost 50% renewable of the 600 terawatt hours. Now the other sectors are not there yet. Heating and mobility. Is that projection of whether there's enough space and whether all the economies can cope with all the build-out that is needed to go into the other sectors and all generating more than thousands of terawatt hours for all countries in Europe?
Okay, so let's be clear. We spent the last 15 years renewabilizing electricity. We have not in any way decarbonized our energy system because we've ignored heat. And so the biggest challenge we have is the next decade of heat, of what do you do with heat. Industrial heat, commercial heat, and residential heat. And it's a really, really big challenge. And it's not going to be done from one day to another. So that's why I would also say to you as well that, again, I go back to if we do have to cut the gas off to the Russians, or they cut the gas off to us, and we have to go and use LNG, we're in for high gas prices for years to come. Years to come, because gas is just taking that gas, liquefying it, and then breaking it into a gas at the other end, just crazy expensive, and you can't change that, right? So it's big challenges for anyone who needs gas going forward. And sorry, I know we don't probably have time to talk about it, but if you talk about hydrogen or something like that, it's also expensive, right? It's also expensive. So again, you're in international competition with someone from the US. Well, guess what? He's going to kill you in this environment going forward, right? See, that means you have to be really, really radical in how you rethink about what's going to happen.
Sorry, I just have a quick effect, because the EVs are coming from precious metals. And at some point in time, we needed to recycle or not recycle them. So what's your opinion in terms of this? Because on one hand, we're very aggressive to electrify, but we're getting those, let's say, precious metals also from the fossil fuels.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So then what you have to look at is energy payback, right? And I mean, the best example I could give to you that is on a solar panel. If I went back 15 years ago when the solar industry started, your energy payback on the production of a solar panel from beginning to end was 10 years. Today it's at 3 years, okay? So that's the key thing that you have to look at. And remember, the other thing is, if I say produce silicon to make a solar panel, what I am going to do, certainly in a European perspective, is 97% of that solar panel will be recycled, okay? 97%. That means, let's be clear, that means I'm producing electricity for 25 years and I have a payback at 3, and then I have an electric car, I have an internal combustion car where I have to dig every single day for that 25-year period to take the fossil fuels out of the ground. So I hear this from the fossil fuel industry, but firstly, it's not true, because just what I've said to you there, because if you look at the payback on burning fossil fuels, well, it's much, much, much longer, and you have to continually do it. But what we do have to do is move away from burning fossil fuels and digging fossil fuels out of the ground to digging all these other materials that we need to actually electrify the system. And that's a really, really, really big challenge. And I'll stop there, and we can talk later on or whatever at the break or a question round. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay for you.